Good evening, everybody. And as is our practice, we dedicate the zchut of the learning that we do to the release of our chatufim, of our captives, the 134 who are still being held in terror dungeons. We hope that the zchut goes to the healing of our cholim and our pitzuim, our brave soldiers who have been wounded on the field of battle, certainly for the safety of our chayalim wherever they may be, and safety, honestly, for Achenu B'nai Yisrael who are endangered around the world. And we added last time that we want protection from our enemies, and we also want protection from our friends. And for a complete victory over Amalek. And that Amalek seems to have grown in terms of the Amalek who is to the north and the Amalek who is to the far northwest. So, biyachad im yirtzeh Hashem ninatzeach. So before we start, I want to point out that we run a risk learning Chovot HaLevavot, and in particular, and in Musar in general. So I want to point out this risk so that we can avoid it, and this is the risk of fatigue. Right, let me explain. One of the characteristics of all of the Musar Sfarim is the need to take the knowledge from the intellectual to the emotional. And the way I describe it is taking it from what we know to what we feel, right? To really deep emotional knowledge. And I call that a 12-inch journey, right? From here to here. And sometimes it takes a lifetime for that journey. And in so doing, in learning Musa, the goal is not to impart new information, but to get that information to move and to be settled. Now, I'll give you a for instance. The Ramchal, right, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, says the following in his Mesilat Yesharim. Actually, these are the opening words of his Sefer. He says, Amar HaMechaber, the author writes, Hachibur hazeh lo chipartiv lilamed livnei adam et asher lo yada'u. The purpose of this book was not to convey any new information that people don't already know, which I thought was always great. You should buy the book and read the book even though there's nothing in it that's new. And he says, but the reason is to remind them of what they already know and what is very familiar for them, for you will find in most of my words only things which most people already know and do not have any doubt about. And you'll have to admit that it's a strange way to start a book. But
not a good way to sell a book.
Not a good way to sell a book, right? You know everything that's here, read it anyways, and read it over and over again. So I'll tell you a story about Rav Chaim Shmulevitz. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, who you may be familiar with, was a Rosh Yeshiva at the Mir Yeshiva. He was there for 40 years. He was there when the yeshiva was in Poland, when it moved to Shanghai, and when it came to Yerushalayim. During a period of time, there was no mashgiach ruchani in the yeshiva. Now, a mashgiach ruchani is an appointed rabbi who is going to teach, who's going to help the students, going to help the avrechim with spiritual issues and help them grow spiritually and help them develop their midot. And part of what he does, in addition to meeting with the students, is he gives something called a Musar Shmuz, which he will talk about Musar topics like we do, right? And it's once a week, and it's usually Thursday nights. So at the Mir Yeshiva, during this period of time, there was no mashgiach ruchani, and Rav Shmulevitz took it upon himself that he was going to address the boys on this topic. And so one week he gave a Musar Shmuz. The next week he gave the same one. And all of the students kind of looked at each other and said, maybe the Rav forgot, I mean, it was really the same thing. And then the third week, he gave it again.
Wow.
And then people understood that something was up. It is in the telling and the retelling of the topics to get it to integrate. The way I look at it, now this is not how he termed it, but there's something called muscle memory. And muscle memory is gotten only if you repeat it again and again and again and again, and then it happens automatically. This is spiritual muscle memory. Now, the reason you want to have muscle memory is that when you're put in a situation where you want to be able to react automatically, it needs to be there automatically.
Wax on, wax off.
Right. And if you think about times, especially with bitachon, that you're in crisis and you need to know what bitachon is, it needs to be there and it needs to be part of our emotional muscle memory. And the reason I bring this up is that we have now, this is now the 5th Shiur that we have done only on Sha'ar HaBitachon. And we have 1 or maybe 2 more. And you're going to be hearing similar concepts that you have heard already, and that's by design. And what we need to do is kind of fight the fatigue element and understand why we're doing this, right? And that's critically important. And I want to put this, and I'll probably repeat this, right, in honor of Rav Shmuel Levitz from time to time, because we will be confronting this as we go. And as my grandchildren say, you told me this already, right? I know, but it bears telling again. So, where are we? We are actually in the middle of discussing 7 areas that we need to be strong in our bitachon, and that we need to apply the basic principles of bitachon, which are, again, everything emanates from Hashem, and everything is part of His plan. Everything that He does has our best interests at heart, and He knows what our best interests are better than we know. And 4th is, despite the fact that the Kadosh Baruch Hu is ultimately in charge, we have our part to play. We have to do our hishtadlut in partnership with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. This is our bitachon mantra, right? This is the knowledge that we want to integrate. And so far, we have explained how this mantra applies in 2 critical areas or situations in our lives. 1 is to our physical well-being, and 2 to our economic well-being, both in good times and bad times, that we have to rely on the fact that we know that the Kadosh Baruch Hu is in charge. And for example, we had the health idea that we know Ani Hashem Rofecha, God is ultimately in charge of seeing that we are healed. But we still have to go to doctors, right? We have our part to play, but we have to have bitachon that the Kadosh Baruch Hu is ultimately in charge. Last week, if you recall, we began a 3rd area where we need to be able to recall our bitachon, and that is in social situations, right? And we talked about loneliness and isolation and feelings of abandonment, and how we have to understand our personal situation vis-a-vis the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and that we're never really alone, and He is always with us. And we talked about areas of bitachon that we need to adopt and attitudes we need to change in how we see the world in those situations. So we're going to continue our discussion today of other social situations, right? Meaning situations where we interact with others that require us to call upon our bitachon in the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And these interactions include everybody around us, our spouses, our family, our friends, our acquaintances, and even our enemies. And we're going to spend some time on exactly what that means. So before we get ahead of ourselves, let's review the 7 areas that the Chovot HaLevavot lists as essential for us to trust the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and how that bitachon should manifest itself. Meaning, what should we do? How should we be feeling? What should we think? So first, as we said, matters that pertain to health and our well-being of our bodies. In other words, taking care of ourselves physically. 2 is matters that pertain to how we sustain ourselves, meaning how we earn a living. 3 is where we are bitachon in situations that involve others or the lack thereof, family, friends, colleagues, and the opposite. Next comes, and we'll get to this today, Mirz Hashem, the idea of reward in this world for my keeping the mitzvot that I alone are responsible for, that impact only me. Things like lighting candles Friday night, going to daven, putting on tefillin, right? They don't join with somebody else. The next area is the bitachon I need to express when I have mitzvot that where I need to interact with somebody else. That is giving tzedakah, giving trumas and maasros. There's a mitzvah that if I find a lost object, I need to return it. So all of those mitzvot. 6 is having bitachon in Hashem when there is a reward due to us in olam hazeh. That is due to us in olam haba, for which we earned. And then there is another area which we'll be spending time on having bitachon in the Kadosh Baruch Hu when we will be rewarded beyond what we deserve. That out of chesed, the Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to give us more than we deserve, and what kind of bitachon we need to express for that. Okay. In a few weeks, we will be sitting around the Seder table reading the Haggadah. And one of the things that we're going to say is the Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to introduce himself, and he's going to say, Ani velo malach, ani velo saraf, ani velo shaliach, ani hu velo acher. Right? The being, the entity that created all of the miracles in Egypt was the Kadosh Baruch Hu. He didn't send a messenger, he didn't send a representative, he didn't send an angel, it was him, right? So the translation is, I am not an angel, I am not a saraf, a different type of angel, I am not a messenger, I am no other, right? God acted alone because he wanted to introduce himself onto the stage for people to understand who was ruling the world and to marvel, right? But what happened in Egypt, as we all know, is a one-time event. If the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants something to happen today, he works through a shaliach, right? He works through either Geder HaTeva, through nature, or he works through individuals. And we have an expression, Yesh harbe shluchim lamakom. And God has a lot of different choices in terms of who he appoints to get what he wants done. Remember in Megillat Esther, when Esther said, I don't think I can do that, he said, if not you, somebody else. God will find somebody else. Right? So there are lots of shlichim, and we have to look for the shluchim in this world. Right? And knowing who is in charge and knowing who is the proxy is really the definition of bitachon in the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And we talked about this idea a lot vis-a-vis how we should view people who are proximate, who are the proximate cause for either our health or our sustenance, right? Either people we work for, that the Kadosh Baruch Hu is providing us through this job, the Kadosh Baruch Hu is healing us through this doctor, right? But ultimately, there is a middleman that the Kadosh Baruch Hu has appointed, but he's the one in charge and making the decisions of what will happen. And we brought an example of how if you have an electrician who was working for you and you needed to pay him but you weren't going to be around. So you asked your neighbor to hold on to the check. So when the electrician showed up to get paid, just hand him the check. And we said that the electrician should not be overwhelmingly grateful to the neighbor for handing him the check because he deserves it because he earned it, and it's not the money of the person who's giving it to them, right? It was a shaliach. He should say thank you. But ultimately, that's how we should understand how the world works. Sometimes we are the shaliach. Sometimes the Kadosh Baruch Hu looks to us and appoints us to do what he wants done. And the example that the Chovot HaLevavot brings is that when we provide for our family, and when we provide for our family, we need to understand that we are really fulfilling the mission that the Kadosh Baruch Hu gave to us to make sure that our families are provided for, right? What he says is, if you look at source 2, if the person trusting in God has a wife, family members, friends, and enemies, he should rely on God to save him from the burden usually associated with being involved with them. What that means is being able to provide for them. And he should make an effort to meet his obligations toward them and to take care of their wants and to do so wholeheartedly. Right? So if you're providing for your family, you're there, you're just like the Kadosh Baruch Hu provides for you. He's providing for them through you, which means you shouldn't think it is your money that you're giving them. It's their money that you're giving them. He should avoid doing anything that will cause them harm. Instead, he should engage in the means that will bring them good, and he should be loyal to them regarding all of these matters. Right? In other words, when we have obligations to our families, we are here to provide for them because the Kadosh Baruch Hu sent us to provide for them. It is a funny way to put it when he says to save them from the burden, usually associated with being involved with them. But, leave the stilted language aside, is that just like you're earning a living comes from the Kadosh Baruch Hu, what you provide for your family comes to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and the money will flow because that's all part of their annual contract in terms of what they will be receiving that year. In this case, then the case we talked before is you are the shaliach, and your motivation should be that you're carrying out as a messenger the will of the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Again, what he writes, he should not do so with the hope that his favors will be repaid, nor to repay them for the good that they have already done for him. It should not be done out of love for the honor and praise that he will give him, or that they will give him, nor in order to rule over them. Rather, it should be done to fulfill the mitzvah of the Creator, to observe his covenant and the instructions concerning them. Right, so sometimes you see that people feel that if they're providing for their families, that magia lahem, right, they, by dint of that, deserve honor, and people should be grateful to him, and we should be grateful to a point, but we should understand, as shlichim, that all we're doing is handing the check, right, and that's what he's talking about.
So how do ultra-religious families where the husband isn't generating income for the household, how do they match that up with this idea?
So the Chovot HaLevavot is written at a time when men were the providers. So it is written in second person male. We live in a different world, and they live in a different world. The one who provides is typically the wife, right? So she has to look at what she provides for the family as being her shlichut. I mean, there's nothing that says that in order to be a shaliach, you have to be male. It is also true that not all avrechim don't work. Right, they do receive stipends, and they do work. Sometimes they do some teaching. So that's not entirely true. But if you look at parents providing for their family, right, it doesn't matter how the family is set up, because whoever it is who is providing the sustenance is the shaliach. The Chovot HaLevavot now posits another situation that is actually quite common. What happens when somebody disappoints us? Meaning we ask them to do a favor for us and they refuse, right? Our natural tendency is to be resentful and sometimes to even be spiteful. Now the Torah warns us against that. The Torah says in Vayikra, source 4, Lo tikom v'lo titor et b'nei amecha v'yahavta l'recha kamocha. We all know the last part of it. You should love your neighbor as yourself. Lo tikom v'lo titor means don't take revenge and don't hold a grudge. Now, our rabbis understood this mitzvah, really these two mitzvahs, very differently than we do as I just read it, right? In common parlance, vengeance and grudges are serious things, right? And they are reserved for serious offenses. If I ask you to lend me your pencil, I'm not going to hold a grudge, right? If you say no, I'm not going to look to take revenge. But if you think about it, the rabbis understood this exactly in the day-to-day of us bumping into each other, because the amount of time that you would do something that would entail grudges and vengeance is virtually non-existent among most people, right? So this is what they say. Chazal understood these mitzvot as referring to our day-to-day lives. The Sefer HaChinuch, which, are you familiar with that book? Okay. The Sefer HaChinuch explains it this way. They bring the Sifra. I'm just going to read it in English. The language of the Sifra Kedoshim, how far is the power of revenge, right? What is it that we're talking about when we're talking about revenge? If one said to another, lend me your sickle, and he did not lend him, the next day the other said to him, lend me your spade. So he said back to them, I will not lend you it, just as you did not lend me your sickle, I am not going to lend you my shovel. And it is written, lo tikom, do not seek vengeance. And he says, and compare this to all things. So really, lending a shovel or not lending a shovel, that falls under vengeance and retaliation. What kind of vengeance is it, right? This is just tit for tat, right? And I'll ask you another question. Even if this falls under vengeance, what does this have to do with bitachon and Hashem? Right? I mean, where does the idea of bitachon come in? So here's what the Chovot HaLevavot says. When the need arises for a person to make a request of either his superior or his subordinate, right, anybody, you should rely on God to deliver his request and consider those people of whom he made the request to be merely the messenger whom God will use to complete his request. If we go back to our mantra, everything emanates from the Kodesh Baruch Hu, and everything is part of his plan. Everything he does has our best interest at heart, and he knows what's best for us. Then not getting the shovel is part of God's plan, and the neighbor is just a shaliach. Now I have to figure out why I can't get the shovel, but it's foolish for me to feel I need to take vengeance against my neighbor because he's not the one who's withholding it from me. It's the Kodesh Baruch Hu, right? And we have an expression in English, or at least in America we have it, don't kill the messenger, right? Which is, the messenger is just the messenger. What we need to do is we need to look inwardly and ask questions why this was being held for us. Typically the phrase that the rabbis say is yifashvesh ma'asav. You should begin to inspect your deeds and to look inwardly to see why the Kodesh Baruch Hu is the one who's not giving you the shovel. And we need to figure out what we need to do differently to get a different outcome, not from the neighbor, but from the Borei Olam. If, on the other hand, the person delivers, and we got the shovel, and he did it b'simcha, we should thank the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Again, we have to thank the neighbor, but we have to still say, my request is being fulfilled for a shovel, temporarily, through my neighbor, right? And we have to give hakarat hatov, but we have to keep reinforcing this idea that nothing happens unless the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants it to happen. And the Chovot HaLevavot reinforces this idea of thanking the Shaliach by pointing out a Gemara from Baba Batra. The Gemara in Baba Batra is actually talking about Benot Slavchad, but it comes up with a principle that says that the Kadosh Baruch Hu only appoints a messenger who is worthy of being a messenger for the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Right? The king is only going to send somebody of value as his messenger. So if somebody fulfills a favor for you, and you know that he is a messenger from the Kadosh Baruch Hu, then he deserves a certain amount of respect for that, right? And for agreeing to carry out what the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants. So the upside to this is the reverse, meaning that if somebody asks you for a favor, and it's within the bounds of propriety and halacha, you should do everything in your power to be able to deliver. But if there are extenuating circumstances and you can't deliver, you can have bitachon in the Kadosh Baruch Hu that this is the way he wanted it to play out. Right? So it kind of lets you off the hook a little bit. What he says is this in source 8. Similarly, if either a superior or subordinate of his makes a request of him, he should wholeheartedly make every effort to perform it, but if possible, he should try to complete the request in private so he would not become haughty as a result. We're going to see this later, meaning that you shouldn't have it open so that people would see that you're doing this favor and look how frum and generous I am. It says the above only applies if the person who asks him for is someone who is deserving of his effort and on his behalf, meaning it has to be an appropriate request. If the request ends up being fulfilled through his efforts because God placed him in the position of being the conduit to the other's good, he should not attribute his success to himself. He should not ask for recompense or thanks from the other person. Rather, he should thank the Kadosh Baruch Hu, one, for choosing him to do good for his friend. However, if he was prevented from fulfilling the request and was not able to do it, he should not blame himself. He should inform his friend that he was lazy in his efforts on his behalf, provided that he did in fact exert himself, and that he was not lazy in his efforts on his behalf, provided that he did in fact exert himself and toil on the person's behalf. One of the nice ideas here, somebody asks you to do you a favor, you can sit there and say, wow, obviously, I am being a shaliach for the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And that's a great feeling. So I fully acknowledge that being able to approach our interactions with people like this is at a very high level, and it is not an easy level of bitachon to maintain. And it even goes against our grain to think like that. And it's even harder to do because at the end of the pasuk in Vayikra that we just cited, it says not only should you not take revenge, but you should not hold a grudge. So here is the definition of a grudge. So your neighbor, you go to your neighbor and you say, I want to borrow your lawnmower. And he says no. The next day, he goes to you and says, I want to borrow your shovel. Now, having gone to this shiur and having learned that pasuk, you know you're going to lend him the shovel, because otherwise you'll be over the lav of lo tikom. But you can't say to them, you know what, you no good so-and-so, I want to show you. You didn't lend you the lawnmower, I'm a much better person than you. I'm going to lend you my shovel. That is lo titor. That is don't hold a grudge. When somebody says no, it's as if, it needs to be as if the event never happened. And it is as if when they come to you and say, can I borrow your shovel, it is as if it is the first time you come. That's a very, very high level of bitachon, and we have to work on it. This next area that Ibn Pakuda brings in terms of social interaction is actually quite difficult to think about. And that is what happens if people actually do you harm, either physical or emotional harm, which happens all the time. In that situation, we also have to apply this mantra that everything comes from the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and we have to understand the world in that way, and that everything is part of his plan. It's very, very, very difficult to accept and to know what to do with. Let me read to you what he writes. It says, however, with regard to matters pertaining to his enemies, those who covet his possessions, those who seek to do bad to him, he should rely on the Creator, may he be exalted. He should tolerate when they embarrass him, and he should not take retribution from them according to their misdeeds. Rather, he should repay them with kindness and do for them any good he is able to do for them. He should remember that ultimately any benefit that he receives and all harm comes from him, that comes to him is in the hands of the Creator, may he be exalted. Wow. Right? The topic of how to react or how to respond to someone who hurts you. Now he talks about your enemy, but it could be your family member, right? Is a huge topic. And as you would expect, it has a lot of theological implications that go well beyond the scope of this particular shiur. That having been said, having just read this, right, I can see in your eyes that it is easy to dismiss this idea as being, you know what, those are for tzaddikim, I'm not a tzaddik, you know, maybe I'll get there, maybe I won't, I'm going to work on it, probably not. But I don't think we can do that, and I don't think we should do that, and I do think that we should work on it. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you a biblical example. Right? We know families are famous for creating harm and damage. Right? The poster child of this is the story of Yosef and his brothers. They literally wanted to kill him. They kidnapped him, sold him to slavery. He lived in Egypt for 21 years. Yet, when he meets his brothers, he says, V'atem chashavtam alai ra'ah, you thought to do me harm. Elohim chashva letovah. God thought to do me good. Leman oseh kayom hazeh lihiyot amrav. Right? His plan was that we should survive as a people and grow into a great people. Now, the way we usually understand this is you thought one way and God had different plans and he overturned your plans. Right? That's how we usually understand it. But Ibn Pakuda would say this. He would say that Yosef would say, look, your intentions really don't matter because you're just messengers for the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Right? The Kadosh Baruch Hu had our interests at heart, and you were just fulfilling his will. Now, he doesn't seek any revenge on them. He just accepts it as axiomatic that they were being directed at what to do. Now, they are responsible for their actions, and they should receive whatever whatever consequences the Kadosh Baruch Hu should have. That's a shiur for another time. But that's his overall reaction. And this is true of families and those who Ibn Pekuda calls enemies. And it is not turn the other cheek. It is saying, God's in charge, and if I have a complaint or a taina, I have to take it up with him. Because ultimately that's where the source is on this. Now,
so how does that explain what happened today when those aid workers were killed?
So I'm not familiar with that.
Today?
Yeah, I'm not.
It's the news today.
Okay, so what happened?
The IDF. It wasn't intentional, but aid workers from Australia, Poland, England, and America, I think, were killed accidentally by the IDF bombing in Gaza. So it wasn't intentional, but using that logic, you would say that God's will was for them to be killed?
Well, so let me answer that question how I understand it. If we say nothing happens unless God wants it to happen, right? If that's our axiom, then somehow that is a true statement. Now the question is why and how that fits in, I have no idea. But I'm glad you asked that question because it leads into the next little piece of discussion. Had we been learning this a year ago, meaning pre-October 7th, I probably would have left it here and said, we have to work on this, and just moved on to the next topic, right, to the fourth area of Ibn Pekuda. And I would have said that, understand this is aspirational, and it's one of the areas we need to work on and keep reminding ourselves. And what I just said is a true statement. But we don't live in a pre-October 7th world. And this requirement for bitachon in the face of our enemies raises an additional question to what you raised, was does that mean that we need to accept Hamas as agents of Hashem, and we need to forgive them or alleviate them of any responsibility and move on and do good for them, right? So given that I am certain that this question was your immediate reaction, as you can see, to the Chovot HaLevavot, and I am equally certain that if I left this question unaddressed, next week when I show up I will be alone, I thought that it would be worth taking a few minutes to talk about that question a little bit. So Chazal approaches this question a little differently, right? The question they ask, although it's just a corollary of it, is should we rejoice at the destruction of our enemies or not? Right? Think about Haman, think about Paro. So, and given the fact that we sit between Pesach and Purim, where we did just that and will do just that, you have to understand that the answer to that question is really not so clear. And it's not so clear because there are two seemingly contradictory psukim in Sefer Mishlei, and also contradictions within the Gemara and other Mamarei Chazal, on how we should react to the destruction of our enemies. And I'll pull it together to show you how, if you turn it around, it is our question. So, if you look at source 11, Shlomo HaMelech says, Bin pol oivecha al tismach, ubikishalo al yagel libecha. In the fall, when your enemy falls, do not exult, right? Don't be excited, and if he trips, don't rejoice. Okay? So that's one, and that would seem to support the Chovot HaLevavot, meaning that he is not your enemy. Whatever harm he did to you, he did because the Kadosh Baruch Hu wanted him to do. If he is getting punished, he's getting punished because the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants him to get punished. It has nothing to do with you. Your punishment or what the bad things he did to you have nothing to do with what's happening to him. That's classic what we just went through, right? But it says, Betuv tzadikim ta'alot kirya. When good things happen to tzadikim, you should rejoice. Uba'avod risha'im rina. And with the destruction of wicked people, the city rejoices. There are shouts of joy. Okay, so now we have the other side that says you should rejoice because there is something that they should be punished for what they did and the evil that they did for you. So what is it that we should take away from these two psukim? Now this is part of obviously a longer shiur, but I just wanted to make this one point. So Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Alav HaShalom, from Gush Etzion, he says whenever you're confronted with this kind of blatant contradiction, the first thing you need to do is step back and make sure that you're talking about the same things. Refine your terms. So here, in these two psukim, there's a fundamental distinction that needs to be made between the word oyev and rasha. Oyev means enemy. Rasha means a wicked person. We also need to make a distinction between what happens to you personally, it says oivecha, and when it talks about the city rejoicing as a community on the fall of somebody who is truly evil. So an oyev, in this context, needs to be seen as a personal enemy, right? Somebody who you have bumped into, who have caused you personally harm. For that person, Shlomo HaMelech says that when you see terrible things happen to that person as a result of the things that they did for you, I mean, when we were kids and you were fighting with somebody and the person you were fighting fell down, you would say, see, God punished you, right? You're being punished, I'm right. You can't say that, right? I mean, that's not what the Chovot HaLevavot is teaching us. A rasha is somebody who's truly evil, right? And that makes a world of difference. We have a responsibility to remove evil from the world. We just finished reading Parshat Zachor, where we are charged with an eternal mission of rooting evil out of the world, midor l'dor, forever, for eternity. And that's how I think we should understand what's going on, certainly in Gaza and certainly in the north, and certainly what's going on around the world. And, it's happening not to us personally, but it's happening to us as a nation. And that kind of evil done to us is evil done to the Kodesh Baruch Hu. And it says, Ki Yad al Keska, that God's name and his throne is incomplete until evil is removed from the world and his name is restored. So, as I said, when we're talking about this, we're talking about people we bump into, and we're talking about family members, and we're talking about, and believe me, it's hard enough, right, to do this. But I don't think the type of evil that we see falls under what the Chovot HaLevavot is asking. And to answer your question about the aid workers, I don't know what to say or how to answer it, right? Because that's a question out of the millions of questions that we can ask, right? You can bring up the hostages who were shot by friendly fire. You can talk about all the soldiers who have also been harmed by friendly fire. I don't know how to answer that. There was an interesting story that I heard that I've actually been thinking about. I wasn't going to bring it, but as long as we're here, that was a story that was told about Rabbi Avigdor Miller. I don't know if you know who he was. He was a Mashkiach Ruchani in Lakewood. And he actually wrote a lot on Musar, and he wrote a perush actually on Chovot HaLevavot. And he was once giving a Musar shmuz, and he was talking about God's involvement in the Holocaust. And everybody there started screaming at him, right? And saying, how is it that you can bring God and bring reasons into the Holocaust? There's no reason, it just happened. And he said, if that's your position, then it's a position of denying God, right? If God is involved in everything, and everything is run according to God's plan, then this, in some way, as difficult as it is to say, is part of God's plan. Now, I don't know how to justify it, I don't know how to explain it, but to say that it isn't denying the pain of the Holocaust, it's denying God's role. And if you go to the Gemara, perhaps the most critical event that happened to us in our history was the destruction of the two Batei Mikdash, because everything we're experiencing now and throughout the 2,500 years or 2,000 years of our history is all because of that event. And yet the Gemara spends lots of time trying to puzzle out, why did it happen? And I'm not talking about historically, what did we do to cause it and to bring it about? Now, we can learn those things because we're thousands of years removed. But they weren't thousands of years removed when they wrote it, right? And if you read Echa, the Navi describes that the blood was putting the fire out in the street. I don't know, that's the Russia. That's the evil that happens in the world. This is more of a handbook for us as we go through life bumping into one another. Questions, comments? Sure.
So at the end of Tefillah, when in Sha'ar, we say, I don't know in Hebrew, but I can say it more or less in English. The last prayer that we say is we pray that God will help us to not toil in vain. Do you know where I'm talking about? Is there a sitter here? When I read that verse, I think it's a wonderful thing to pray for, but it kind of goes against the idea that we should trust that what we're doing is because God wants it to be that way. But if we are, thank you, perfect. It's like a contradiction, though.
So tell me why you think it's a contradiction.
Because
I think it's testing your faith in God.
Which happens a lot.
every day.
That's why we need to build this emotional muscle memory. Imagine what it took Yosef to say to his brothers. Don't worry about it. It wasn't you. It's not your plan. It wasn't a great camel ride, but ultimately you're not in charge.
Why does responsibility for our own deeds?
Well,
I couldn't hear what you said.
so the question is, and it's a great question, which has to do with if God is ultimately in charge and things happen because he wants them to happen, why can't I simply say, God wanted me to murder him, therefore I'm off the hook? I'm trying to come up with an answer al regel echad. So, go ahead.
So this is the English. It's the verse is, may he open our heart to his Torah, imbuing our heart with the love and awe of him, that we may do his will and serve him with a perfect heart, so that we neither toil in vain nor give birth to confusion. But to me, when I read that, it means that whoever wrote this toiled in vain, or witnessed people toiling in vain, because we're praying that, please God, don't let that happen. But it does.
So
if we're toiling in vain and we're praying, we don't want to be doing that, or we don't want to be doing that.
right.
Doesn't that contradict with the idea of
all from Hashem.
So here's my dilemma. We're going to be covering that next week.
Okay.
And it sounds like I'm being dismissive. I don't mean to be dismissive,
Okay.
but we are going to cover that question next week. In terms of your question, that question comes up every year at the Pesach Seder. So if you're looking for a vort at the Pesach Seder, everybody asks, why was Paro punished if it was God's will? Right, that's your question. So there's the one idea, and obviously there are many, is that God can decree that something happen. He may not decree that you have to do it. When the Kadosh Baruch Hu told Abraham that we were going to be slaves for 400 years, he didn't say it was going to be in Egypt. He just said we're going to be slaves for 400 years. Paro decided that he wanted to pick up that mantle. And if his motivation had been, I'm doing God's work and God wants them to be slaves and I'm going to enforce what God wants and not go beyond. God didn't say, murder our babies. He didn't say, bury people into city walls.
He enjoyed it a bit too much.
And he enjoyed it, right? And when Moshe came and said, God says stop, he said, who? If you want, let me know. We can take a break and do some Haggadah Pesach stuff. If you would like to do that, I'd be happy to talk about some of the Haggadah things that make no sense.
Oh, I'd like that.
You'd have to see the majority.
Okay.
For next week or for
For the next 2 or 3.
For the next 2 or 3 weeks. Okay, because the Haggadah was written not to be understood.
Yeah.
The Haggadah makes no sense. Absolutely, positively no sense. And why is that? Right, I'll give you a for instance. There's Rabban Gamliel Omer, right? There were 10 plagues in Egypt and 50 plagues at the sea. Really? No, there weren't 50 plagues at the sea. There were 200 plagues at the sea. No, there weren't 200 plagues at the sea. There were 250 plagues at the sea. I read Parshat B'Shalach. There were no plagues at the sea. What exactly is that doing there? And why do we say that? Right? And then we have this whole thing at the end, this after party, this nirtza, where everybody is singing Echad Mi Yodea and saying, do I really need to say this piyut? It's already late. Can we go home? You're done. You bench. You go home. What is that doing there? Okay, so I'll see what I can do for the next couple of weeks, but you have to come back afterwards so we can move on. All right. Have a wonderful night. Thank you.